What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, what I want to talk about with you guys is kind of the final bow on top of the present here for my redraft rankings, at least for now. At this point, we have talked very much in detail about the quarterbacks, the running backs, the wide receivers, the tight ends. So we're not going to go into a ton of detail today, but this video is still going to be very important for you guys because you will see how I am viewing all of these players stacked up against each other despite the position, which will show you guys how I am drafting these guys, which rounds I think that you should be drafting these guys, and why I am so high on some of these players in comparison to consensus. All of those videos that we talked about, they will be linked in the description, so I strongly encourage you to go check those out. But without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about my top 50. So I think the best way that I'm going to do this today is because we are talking about 50 players, I'm going to group them in groups of 10. So we'll talk about my top 10, then my top 20, then my top 30, and so on. You guys kind of get the deal, but I'm going to put them up on the screen. What you are going to be looking at is the overall rank that I have them in my rankings. You'll see the positional rank. ECR is expert consensus ranking. So that is where expert consensus is ranking these players currently. And then the verse ECR is how high or low I am on that player in comparison to my rankings and expert consensus. So as you can see here in my top 10, there's not a lot different from expert consensus, really, to say the least. There's Christian McCaffrey at the number 1, CeeDee Lamb's my 2, Tyreek Hill, Jahmyr Chase, Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, AJ Brown, and Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, Jahmyr Gibbs is really the guy that I am the most different on up to this point. And the reality is, this is a guy who last year on very limited touches, he was super efficient for fantasy football. He still gave us RB1 numbers from a fantasy points per game standpoint. I think this is a guy that going into year 2, you look at the Lions, they have kind of retained Ben Johnson, who that is going to be a big thing for this offense moving forward. He is going to make this one of the highest scoring offenses in the NFL. So there is a lot to like about the Lions. And if Jahmyr Gibbs gets any type of potential increase in workload, maybe some more volume, whether that be in the receiving game, in the rushing game, whatever it may be, I think he has the ability to destroy fantasy football and easily finish as a top 5 guy, because you look at last year and how many touches he was getting. This is a guy who got less rushing attempts than Zach Moss, Ezekiel Elliott, Tyler Algier, Gus Edwards, and some of these guys, most of these guys were not even starters for the entirety of the year. So I think Jahmyr Gibbs, the ceiling is sky high. He's a guy I'm very high on, but you see, we're 3 spots above consensus. The rest of the guys, a lot of good running backs, a lot of good wide receivers. There's really not too much to be picky about in the first round. So let's move on to my 11 through 20 range. You have guys on here like Puka Nacua, Garrett Wilson, Jonathan Taylor, Marvin Harrison Jr., Drake London, Saquon Barkley, Brandon Aiyuk, Travis Etienne, Kyren Williams, and Devon Achane. And a lot of people this year are saying that this second round is not really a good round for your draft picks. And I know that the top of this round is kind of actually the back of the first round, depending on the leagues that you play in. But you'll see there's still a ton of very good players, and there's some players that I'm still high on in this round compared to consensus. You have guys like Puka and Garrett Wilson that obviously are first round talents. Jonathan Taylor, he could be a first round talent depending how you view it. But Marvin Harrison Jr., he's a guy that I am very high on compared to consensus. And I understand this is a rookie wide receiver, so it is very risky to draft a rookie this highly. I mean, you see I have him as the 14th overall player, an early second round pick. This is going to be the highest ADP for a rookie wide receiver ever in the history of the NFL in fantasy football. Like, that is legitimately a fact. He is going to be the highest drafted player. But with that being said, this is a guy who is going into a situation with Kyler Murray, who I've been very vocal about how much I love Kyler Murray this year, how much I just love this Arizona Cardinals offense. If you've been watching these videos, you know that I'm also high on James Conner. I think this team can take a massive step forward, and for them to do that this year, Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to have to be dominant for fantasy football. I'm not kidding when I say that this is a guy who could have a Justin Jefferson, Puka Nacua, Jahmyr Chase type of rookie season. This is the type of talent that Marvin Harrison Jr. is coming out of Ohio State. I know it's going to feel risky. I know it's going to feel scary drafting a player like Marvin Harrison this high, but I think he has top 10 potential as a rookie at the wide receiver position. And this is a guy that I'm very comfortable still drafting as a top 14 player in my fantasy football drafts. Now, another guy going into this year that I'm high on is Drake London. We talked about him a ton in the wide receiver video, but I'll give you kind of the Cliff Notes version as to why I am high on him. You look at this offense stemming from the Los Angeles Rams over the last couple of seasons, and you look at the quarterback upgrade in Kirk Cousins, who has consistently fed his wide receiver one. Now, we talk about Kirk Cousins and we talk about the Rams, and what do they have in common? Well, Kirk Cousins continuously feeds that wide receiver one. He's had Justin Jefferson looking incredible over years past, and I know that's Justin Jefferson. He's a generational talent as well. We know that now, looking at this, he is a future Hall of Famer, and I'm not saying that Drake London is, but he is going to feed Drake London. And then that Rams offense, they've force-fed guys like Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, even Robert Woods in years past. I think they're going to do the same in this offense. Drake London, he has all the opportunity in the world, all the potential in the world, and he is a damn good wide receiver. So he's a guy that I'm a little bit higher on. I currently have him as my wide receiver 10. And then the other guy that kind of sticks out is Achane. And we know Achane has the ability to blow up any given week. I mean, we saw it last year when he gave us a 50-point week in fantasy football. That has the ability to entirely just destroy your matchup. That is the type of game breaker that Achane is. Now, you look at this year, yes, there is going to always be a little bit of injury concerns with Achane, especially because you look at the build that he has. He's just not necessarily going to have the prototypical size for one of these running backs. But the Miami Dolphins, they have one of the best run offenses in the NFL. Raheem Mostert, as much as he scored all of those touchdowns last year, and he was a very, very good fantasy football option, he's a year older, and those type of touchdown numbers, they're going to have regression. I can't imagine that he does that ever again. This is a guy in Achane who has the ability to be the number one back in this offense, at least the 1A to the 1B of Raheem Mostert. And I think Achane, if you have him on your team, it's going to feel risky always, but he has the ability to blow up like nobody else in fantasy football. And he's just a guy that I would much rather have on my team, because if my opponent has him and is playing against me, I know he has the ability to make me lose any given week. So give me a guy like Achane, but you see there's a couple running backs that I have just a little bit higher than him, Travis Etienne and Kyren Williams. Now moving on to this 21 to 30 range, there's a couple names on here that I want to talk about. Let's just go through the list so far. Derrick Henry comes in at 21, Davante Adams 22, 23 Chris Olave, Isiah Pacheco, Deebo Samuel, Mike Evans, Nico Collins, Jaylen Waddle, Michael Pittman Jr., and Rachaad White. And one thing I want to know is Davante Adams is actually kind of falling down my rankings just a tiny bit. Nothing crazy, but you see I'm a little bit lower on him and Chris Olave than consensus. I just worry about these offenses. I know that Netflix has the receiver show. It's got a lot of people excited about Davante Adams. I really wouldn't actually be surprised if he starts moving up ECR ranks because of this show. It's just a really good show, and it's pretty likable for Davante Adams. You see the struggles that he had last year. I just don't know if Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell are going to solve those issues for this offense. We project this to kind of be a bad offense still going into the 2024 season. So Davante Adams, he worries me. The age is a little bit older. He's lost some of the ability for the after the catch stuff. He doesn't have that big play potential anymore. I'm just a little bit worried about Davante Adams, but this is still a guy who could see 150 targets. So we're obviously not fading him too far. He's still my wide receiver 12. Chris Olave, kind of the same thing. Derek Carr, not a lot to like here. He could see a ton of targets, but he hasn't really given us wide receiver 1 numbers at all in his career up to this point. And wide receiver 13, where I currently have him, would still be his best finish ever to date. So Chris Olave, obviously I like him, just need to see him do it, and I'm a little bit worried about the offense. But let's talk Isiah Pacheco, because Isiah Pacheco is a guy I am higher on the consensus. You see they have him at 32. I have him at 24. He's my RB 11. This is a guy who lost Jerick McKinnon out of the backfield. CEH comes back, but we know the story of CEH for fantasy football. Isiah Pacheco should see the entirety of this workload for the most part. Maybe CEH is a sneaky guy for some passing down work when they do decide to rest Pacheco a little bit this year. But if he sees any type of increase in the receiving work, which he possibly could with McKinnon out the door, and the offensive upgrades that we had in Kansas City this year with Xavier Worthy, Rashee Rice obviously being there, Travis Kelce being there, Hollywood Brown being there now, he is very efficient with the football in his hands. There's going to be a lot of rushing upside. There's going to be a lot of touchdown upside and potentially an increase in receiving work. This makes Isiah Pacheco a low-end running back 1 for me this year, and somebody that I am very happy to target as my RB2 on my teams. But even if I'm getting him as my RB1 and I kind of go after the wide receiver position early, this is a guy I'm very comfortable with. Now for the next couple of people, there's really nothing of note there. I want to get to Michael Pittman and Rachaad White. Pittman, he's a guy that apparently I am still higher on the consensus. Didn't necessarily feel like I was going to be much higher on him than where the consensus is, but he continues to be underrated. We talked about Michael Pittman a little bit in that wide receiver episode. You're looking at the offense with Anthony Richardson. I think it scares people. They don't don't know what he's going to be as a passer. I think Michael Pittman has continuously been good for us in fantasy football, despite not having good quarterback play for the majority of his career for the most part. So I'm not really going to fade a guy like Michael Pittman Jr. I have him as my wide receiver 18. That puts him in this wide receiver 2 range for your fantasy football rosters, coming off the board as the 29th overall player for me. I just feel very comfortable in a guy like Michael Pittman Jr. I mean, you look at last year, career year, 15.6 fantasy points per game, 14th overall. You have a little bit of a downtick this year in my rankings at least. I don't think he's going to fall back to where he was in 2022 and 2021. And even those years, he was averaging 13.5 and 14 fantasy points per game, putting him in that 21 to 22 range. So 18, that kind of meets him in the middle. Not saying that that's really what I did with my rankings, but really wouldn't be surprised if that's kind of the outcome that you get with a guy like Michael Pittman Jr., which apparently is still ahead of where consensus has him at. And then you have Rachaad White, another guy who's coming off of a career year. You look at last year, 990 rushing yards, didn't quite get that 1,000-yard mark, but he probably could have. But the receiving yards is really what I want to talk about, because you have 64 receptions for 549 receiving yards. That gave him 15.8 fantasy points per game, which was 10th best in the NFL. I think this is a guy who, even though I have him as my RB12, and even though I don't really love a guy like Rachaad White long term, I think he could still have another RB1 season in his bag here this year in 2024. And even at worst, he's probably going to be a high-end RB2. People are going to talk about Bucky Irving and what Bucky Irving could be in this offense. Really, it feels a lot to me like the Sean Tucker hype that we got a year ago, and they still just ran the wheels off of Rachaad White. I think he's just one of those running backs that they're going to use. He's not going to be super efficient. He's going to get a ton of work in the receiving game. And at the end of the day, Baker Mayfield, he checks the football down. That's probably going to continue. There's going to be offensive concerns with Dave Canales not there anymore, but the reality is you can't really fade a running back that's going to be used this heavily in the receiving game. And I currently have him as my RB12, which is 8 spots above consensus because he is being drafted around 38 overall. I have him here at 30. Now moving on to the 31 through 40 range, we're going to kick it off with Josh Allen. Then you have Travis Kelce, Jalen Hurts, Joe Mixon, Sam Laporta, DJ Moore, James Cook, DK Metcalf, Josh Jacobs, and Lamar Jackson. So really the theme of this grouping here, kind of the late 3rd round, early 4th round of your drafts, this is where I'm starting to look at those elite quarterbacks, those elite tight ends. And you'll see I'm lower than consensus on Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts and Travis Kelce and all of these guys really at those positions. And the reality is because I just think that this position is so good and so deep, especially this year. There's 5 tight ends that I love. There's probably like 10 plus quarterbacks that you could be comfortable with as your quarterback 1. So I'm not going to be the first guy to reach for him. I think that's more so my strategy and not me being low on the players, because I love all of these players. Clearly, they're my QB1s, my tight end 1s, all of that stuff. But let's talk a little bit about Joe Mixon, because Joe Mixon is a guy that I'm 10 spots higher on than ECR. You look at what he did over the last couple of seasons with Cincinnati. He's been nothing but good for our fantasy football teams. A top 5 finish in fantasy points per game in 2021, top 7 in 2022, 11 in 2023. So you see a little bit of a decline in that fantasy points per game. That's pretty much just because he's lost a little bit of the efficiencies. He's not getting as much usage as he did in 2021. You look at the new situation. He goes to Houston here. Just like we said with the Lions, I think this is going to be one of the best offenses in the NFL. There's going to be plenty of touchdown opportunity. There's going to be a lot of games where they're up and they're just grinding the clock out. They're going to lean on Joe Mixon in those terms. And you have guys behind him like Dameon Pierce, Jawar Jordan, Dare Ogunbowale. Nobody really relevant for the most part behind him that really worries me from a usage standpoint for Joe Mixon. I think this is a guy who has RB1 upside this year. I currently have him as my RB13, but he's going to be a value in fantasy football drafts, especially if the ADP is lining up with that ECR where you have him in that 44 range. I have him at 34. Definitely a guy that I'm going to have on a lot of fantasy teams this year. And then really only 2 other guys that I want to talk about a little bit in detail here in this range. You have DJ Moore here at 36. I'm a little bit lower than ECR. I just have some concerns about the efficiency that he had last year. There really wasn't a ton of competition. He gets some added competition. Even last year when he didn't have competition, he was getting big play touchdowns and things like that, where if that comes down at all this year, there's going to be some regression, which I almost am going to bake that in at this point. You have Rome Odunze, Keenan Allen being added here. Yes, we think Caleb Williams is a better quarterback than what he has had in years past, but rookie quarterbacks, they usually don't throw for a ton of touchdowns. touchdowns. The yardage isn't as high as some of the veterans that you do have. Not that I dislike the guy, not that I think that he's going to be a bad player, but when you're in this range here where you can take a shot at the QB1, the tight end 1, you kind of pick your poison there. I just would rather do that than take a guy like DJ Moore. But at the end of the day, he's probably still going to give us wide receiver 2 numbers, so I'm not too worried about DJ Moore. But you see, I'm just a little bit lower than consensus. Now, James Cook, he's another guy that I'm higher on than the consensus. They have him coming off at 43. I have him at 37. You just look down the stretch last year for the Buffalo Bills. That's when they went to Joe Brady as the offensive coordinator. He is returning this year. They really leaned on the run game heavy, and that's kind of when James Cook took off for fantasy football. A lot of top 12 finishes for him down the stretch. I think this is a guy who has that receiving ability out of the backfield. He's going to get those PPR points. They're going to lean on him. He's going to score a lot of touchdowns. You have Stephon Diggs, who leaves that offense. Probably means that they're going to have to lean on the run a little bit more. And if they're not up in games, they're going to be trying to catch up in games. And James Cook is probably one of the better receiving options that they have out of this offense right now. So I like a lot of James Cook this year. I think he could potentially have a RB1 season, and he has a little bit of a sneaky value in drafts as well because you're getting him in that 43 overall range. I just have him a little bit higher here as my RB14 in that 37 range. And then we'll move on here to the last piece. We have 41 through 50. We'll kick it off with Devontae Smith. You got Pat Mahomes, Stephon Diggs, Cooper Kupp, Mark Andrews, T. Higgins, Trey McBride, Kyler Murray, Dalton Kincaid, and Alvin Kamara. And really, again, lower on Patrick Mahomes because really just the quarterback position being a little bit lower when I start taking them off the board. Love Patrick Mahomes. Don't need to talk about Patrick Mahomes because you shouldn't be worried about him. I guess I just have him a little bit lower when I start taking the quarterbacks early. But there's glaring differences on this right here. You see the 17 and the 19 on the ECR for Kyler Murray and Dalton Kincaid. These two are slowly turning into my guy type of players for the 2024 season. I love these guys. Kyler Murray, I've talked about it at length. We don't need to talk too much about Kyler Murray. If you want to watch the quarterback episode, there is a ton about Kyler Murray where I talk about him in my rankings and why I have him as the QB5 in 2024. But in short, like I've mentioned, I love this Arizona Cardinals offense. I think Kyler Murray has been severely disrespected this offseason over the last year or so. When he is healthy, when he is playing fantasy football games, he is on the type of pedestal as guys like Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Andrew Luck. And this is from a fantasy points per game standpoint. Like, he is scoring as much as all of those guys. There's no way you can debate it. You look at the facts, he really is. So there is no reason why a guy like Kyler Murray, who is trending up right now and is going to have one of the better wide receivers that he's played with, probably not named Larry Fitzgerald or DeAndre Hopkins, in a guy like Marvin Harrison Jr. that I've already talked about, I'm very high on. You have Trey McBride in year 2, James Conner, all of these guys. I think this is going to be a very, very fun offense, and I think Kyler Murray is going to go crazy for fantasy football. I would feel very comfortable with Kyler Murray this high in my drafts in this 48 range as my QB5. And Dalton Kincaid, we talked a little bit about that Bills offense. There really is no reliable pass catchers in this offense, probably outside of Dalton Kincaid. You have guys that I like throwing darts on like Curtis Samuel, Khalil Shakir. You could even say if you like Keon Coleman going into the year, sure. But Dalton Kincaid, he is going to be a center point of this offense. When they drafted Dalton Kincaid, Brandon Beane talked about this potentially being Josh Allen's Travis Kelce. They wanted to mimic what the Kansas City Chiefs had done over the last couple of years with Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes. If that is still the plan for Dalton Kincaid, he is going to be absolutely electric for fantasy football, and I have him much higher than consensus. He is my tight end 5. I think he is in the same conversation as guys like Mark Andrews, as Trey McBride, and I think that there is a probable chance that this year, if we look back in hindsight, going into 2025, we could be talking about Dalton Kincaid as potentially the tight end 1 of 2024. He could very well finish as the number 1 tight end this year, and I would not be surprised. This is a guy that I absolutely love, and you look at what he did last year from week 8 on, he didn't really get going until week 8. They didn't really give him a ton of these snaps until week 8, and that took a Dawson Knox injury for them to see that. But from that point forward, he had 6 finishes as a top 7 tight end. You look at this with Stephon Diggs out of the picture, just feed him more targets. I love a tight end option that can be the number 1 receiving option in his offense. That is exactly what Dalton Kincaid can be. If he is the cheapest of those 5 guys that we mentioned, Laporta, Kelce, McBride, Andrews, just give me Dalton Kincaid at a discount because I think there's a chance that he could outscore any and every single one of those guys going into the 2024 season. So there you have it. That was our video for the day. The top 50 overall rankings in fantasy football for your 1 quarterback redraft leagues. Like I've mentioned, if there were players in this video that we didn't talk about in detail, I can almost guarantee we've talked about them in any of these videos that you guys see here on the screen. I promise you can go into the description. You can find those. We'll link them all in the description as well. Those are definitely worth the watch if you are preparing for these drafts. And if you want a chance to win your fantasy football draft against your league mates and get an edge on them going into this season, I promise you should check them out. If you like the video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and last but not least, make sure you go join our Discord. I do have a free Discord linked in the description. As always, I'm in there helping you guys with your fantasy football drafts, dynasty, redraft, best ball, anything you need. It's the best way to ask me any type of question. And just on top of that, we have a super dope community here at the League FFB. People want to help each other win their leagues as well. Maybe even find a league to play in if you're looking to add a couple more. But with all of that being said, I will see you guys on our next video. But until then, peace out.